Hey everybody, so I want to go over with you an important aspect of our offer to purchase that you may not be aware of. And it pertains to when a buyer would be owed a refund of their due diligence fee. This is a loophole that we've discussed with one of the attorneys on the forms committee, with the real estate commission, as well as NCAR's legal staff. And it's something that I think most agents aren't really aware of, that even I didn't have a clear understanding of it until a particular situation came up that brought it to light. And even the attorney on the forms committee said, well, gosh, that's not really our intention. And so let me dive into it a little bit, and then you can reach out to me with any questions that you have. So if you look here at the screen, paragraph 8 of our standard offer to purchase talks about seller obligations. So these are the things that the seller must do to comply with the contract. And there's a list of things in here, including providing access to the property, removing their personal property and trash before closing, signing the lien waiver saying there are no unpaid liens on the property, paying off any liens that there are, et cetera, et cetera. So paragraph 8 lists all these different things that a seller must do in order to comply with the contract. And if they don't, they're in breach. And then at the very end of paragraph 8, it actually tells you what happens if the seller does not comply and is in breach of the contract. And if the seller is in breach, it says, you can see the highlighted area, then the earnest money deposit and the due diligence fee shall be refunded to the buyer, and the seller shall reimburse the buyer any reasonable costs incurred by the buyer in connection with the buyer's due diligence without affecting any other remedies. So literally, if a seller leaves trash in the property or doesn't remove their personal property, and the buyer can choose to terminate the contract. Now, it's not quite that simple, because you have the delayed 14 days that a seller can delay the closing and that kind of thing. But if the buyer is terminating because of a reason in paragraph 8, then they would be owed their due diligence fee back. Now, obviously, always advise your clients to talk to attorneys before pulling the trigger on things like that. But just be aware that anything here in paragraph 8, buyer can terminate and be owed their due diligence fee back. It's spelled out in paragraph 8N. Okay. However, if you scroll down to paragraph 11, risk of loss / condition of property at closing. So this is the paragraph that talks about that the property needs to be in substantially the same or better condition at closing as it was at the time of contract. But there's a little gotcha here. See the highlighted section that says buyer may terminate this contract by written notice delivered to seller, and the earnest money deposit shall be refunded to the buyer. It doesn't say that the due diligence fee will be refunded to the buyer. So think about what this means. If you show up to do your final walkthrough and the hardwood floors are scratched from the movers, let's say, buyer could say, well, the house is not in substantially the same or better condition, I'm going to terminate. And they can terminate. However, they're only owed their earnest money back, not their due diligence fee. So you figure hardwood floors getting scratched, doors, walls being dinged up, maybe a window got broken, the roof could be leaking. These are things that could happen. You find out at your final walkthrough, and your buyer, even though the seller is in breach of contract, what they're in breach of contract for does not actually allow them to get their due diligence fee back. Take it a step further. What if the house burns down? And we asked this question of the attorney who's on the forms committee. And if the house burns down, the buyer, of course, can terminate, but they're not owed their due diligence fee back. Now, of course, hopefully a seller would refund it, and the buyer is entitled to the insurance proceeds, but the buyer is not looking for money. They want a house, so they need to terminate the contract. And you would think they would get their due diligence fee back, but the way our contract is structured, they wouldn't be owed that money back. Now, of course, they could fight it and talk to an attorney and do all that, but just be aware that our contracts are spelled out this way. So the reason why this is also important is because what if your buyer did a $5,000 or $10,000 or more due diligence fee in order to win a contract, and then they're faced with a roof leak that damaged the entire second floor? The seller is savvy enough to know this about our contract, and they say, well, you can terminate, but I'm not going to give you your $15,000 due diligence fee back. That puts the buyer in a really tough spot. So we had Keisha Arnett of Arnett Law draft up an addendum that we can use. Now, I wouldn't necessarily murk up kind of a typical deal where maybe you've got a $500 or $1,000 due diligence fee. But if you have a buyer doing a substantial due diligence fee, you may want to consider using this addendum. And the addendum basically says if the buyer terminates because of paragraph 11, so the property is not in substantially or better condition at closing, if the buyer terminates because of that, they would get a refund of their earnest money in addition to their due diligence fee. So we've got this addendum. We're going to put it in .loop for you, so it's there in our Choice Residential documents. So you can use it if you need to. Feel free to talk to me about it, in advance if you'd like, if you have a situation where you think it would make sense. Now, again, a typical situation, typical due diligence fee, maybe you don't need to use it. I would guess that most agents in our market don't even realize that the seller wouldn't have to refund the due diligence fee if they were in breach of contract for the house not being in the same condition. I would think that most agents believe that, in fact, a seller would owe that due diligence fee back because they breached the contract. Certainly, that's what I thought going into this. So, again, you don't necessarily need to muddy things up if it's a small due diligence fee, but when you get into larger amounts, it may be worth protecting their money a little bit more because this is kind of an unintended consequence. So hopefully the Forms Committee will review this. They will just simply add in that the due diligence fee will get refunded. But in the meantime, or if they don't change it, we have that addendum as a resource for you. So certainly let me know if you have any questions, and we will talk soon.